Hello, everyone. I'm Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ESN, and I am here to welcome you to this panel on Kazakhstan, on the recent developments in Kazakhstan. I'm delighted that we are able to bring this panel of experts to you who will be speaking about what's happening and putting it into context and helping us make sense of what's going on in Kazakhstan. I'm very happy that we were able to put this together in such a short time, and I'm going to introduce Hélène Thibault, who has organized the panel and who will be moderating it. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Nazarbayev University. And I will give the virtual floor over to Hélène immediately so that she can start describing the panel, introducing the panelists, and we'll be here to listen to what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I know there are a lot of panels out there, lots of interventions, but there is a lot to say about those events that have rocked our world, academic world, and our personal world in the last few days. And there's always something new developments coming every day. So I think it's relevant to have as many panels as we can. But I think ours today will bring an interesting perspective. We have the scholars who have studied and researched over the last few years very different aspects of Kazakhstani politics, domestic and international politics. The biographies of the speakers, I will introduce them very briefly, and the biographies of the speakers will be posted in the chat box. This is a webinar format, so you can ask your question in the Q&A box at the very bottom of the screen you can see. So we will be monitoring, and then I will relay the questions to the speakers. Each speaker will have around 10 minutes to present their point of view on the issue, their informed assessment on the issue. But before we start, I just wanted for the record to make a very brief summary of what has happened since the beginning of the year in Kazakhstan. Though, as we all know, the protests started in West Kazakhstan, in the cities of Zhanaozen and Aktau, which actually have, interestingly, a history of mobilization. If you remember the deadly labor conflict that took place there in December 2011, which was also a sort of quite a traumatic event, I think, for many Kazakhstanis and for the government itself. So these protests started over the price of liquefied gas, but quickly they spread all over Kazakhstan in most of the major cities all across the country. And these were really unprecedented and really unexpected. That level of civic mobilization has not been recorded before to that extent. They were mostly peaceful on few exceptions, and the major one being Almaty. But also there were episodes of violence in other cities like Aktau and Taras, which is in the north and in the south. So there's maybe a geographical dimension to this that we can unpack. But in Almaty, as we know, they were quite violent, and it's still unclear how this violence could happen, who perpetrated the violence. There are many rumors about what is the identity of those who joined peaceful protesters and created chaos in the city. This was followed, as you know, by a strong response from the government and the call for the CSTO to intervene. So this conflict, which was a national conflict, quickly became a geopolitical issue, which has ramifications internationally. So today, what we wanted to do was to, well, I should also mention that things have quieted down now, and that the situation seems to be stable. And I, as far as I could tell, as I could read today, CSTO forces are already pulling out of Kazakhstan. But there are new developments every day, because the power struggle that took place during this moment of chaos is also extremely significant. What was sort of this aspect of the problem was not very visible at the very beginning, but it unfolded against the backdrop of popular protest. So it's a very complex political developments, and the change of not the change, but the elite reshuffling that is happening right now is also will bring quite significant changes to the country. So to unpack all of this today, so we have three speakers. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Diana Kudai-Bergenova. She is a lecturer in sociology at Cambridge University. You can read her biography in the chat box. She has been researching social movements and social mobilization for quite some time. So her role today will be to sort of give us a better overview of who were the protesters, what their identity, their goals, their objectives, and as well as something that has been maybe overlooked a little bit so far is the national identity, the role of national identity and nationalism in the protests. So thank you again for being here. So please, Jana, I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the organizers. As I always say, ASN is one of my core associations, because I am a student of nationalism, and it's always a pleasure to come back here. And welcome to everybody who is listening to us right now, and thank you for joining. I'll try to briefly talk about the social movements that I've been studying, and then I'll immediately move into how the framework of how I'm seeing it and what's going to happen precisely from the nationalistic perspective, from nationalism perspective, because this is, again, the turf of the ASN. So let me talk briefly about the existing social movements that were on the ground. Again, we're operating here in the situation where, first of all, complexity, second of all, deinstitutionalization of a lot of these groups, deinstitutionalization of the opposition itself as well. Again, my forthcoming manuscript hopefully will cover that ground, sort of like where does the shift happen, and why do I believe that 2011 is a key event in this particular continuity, because before that we had a pretty much opposition that came itself from the regime, and these were old guards, old elites who were very close to Nazarbayev. They were ministers, former governors of specific regions, and very powerful elites. And then after that, after the very tragic events in Zhanaozen in 2011, that do have very traumatic and sort of symbolic meaning for a lot of Kazakhstani citizens, we see the very rapid disintegration of that old opposition that no longer can serve as an important sort of political player and as an important reflection to the regime itself. And we see the emergence of very much different but deinstitutionalized movements, networks, and groups on the ground spread all across Kazakhstan, but they're very much localized, which is another thing that we need to understand in complexity. We see the very much informal labor unions in the industrial places like Western Kazakhstan and Central Kazakhstan. We see more sort of disintegrated and deinstitutionalized movements emerging slowly but surely in places like Almaty, which is a traditional hub for opposition in Kazakhstan, and also Astana slowly but surely as well, joining the spread. I think what's also very important, again, briefly, 2011, 2014, Black Tuesday protest against the devaluation of tenge, 2016 mass protests, land protests that we've seen again emerging in West Kazakhstan, which is also very important, the kind of like the protest, the contention spirit of it. And then 2019, where actually my next manuscript starts, with the resignation of President Nazarbayev, we see the structural change, a window of opportunity, where many political groups emerge as social movements that are still deinstitutionalized, but they at least emerge in some form where they claim the political agency. And I'm particularly looking into the movement called Wake Up Kazakhstan or Young Kazakhstan. They claim their name from a very famous Kazakh poem, O Young Kazakh, by Abdulatov from 1909. And then what is very important for ASN here is that they change that Wake Up Kazakh, which is a very symbolic and important nationalistic text for a lot of Kazakhstani citizens. They change that into Wake Up Kazakhstan. And I'm going to come back to the idea of why and how they move beyond the specific ethnic perspective to a more, if you want, civic or political identity. And there's a very much interesting discussion on the ground when I interviewed them. And they said we wanted to look beyond specific ethnicity. And this is the second point well, the third point I'll come back to, why ethnicity plays such an important role in these movements. Another movement that we really need to look at is Janbolat Mamai's movement. He's a very well-known political figure. He does advocate for certain sort of political traumas. He did make the movie about the Kazakh famine in 1933. He does claim that the Soviet past is the colonial past and it needs to be decolonized. So all of these complexities come into play here. But he's also bilingual. He speaks both in Russian and Kazakh to his supporters, and he also tries to move away from this old Soviet perspective of socio-ethnic division that the Nazarbayev regime has established based on the Soviet nationalities policy legacy in Kazakhstan. And that's my second point that I really want to look into through the framework that I've developed in my second book, Nationalizing Regimes. Precisely, this is the framework, is that nationalizing regimes is the type of power field where some of the most powerful elites and decision makings are formed in order to manage to control and impose specific discursive and nation building outcomes on the wider population, including ethnic minorities, and basically to control the specific meaning making and meaning production precisely about nationalism and nation building in Kazakhstan. Why did they do that? Because they believed, of course, and understood in the context of a very multi-ethnic and multi-confessional society that the stability and the provision of dominant discourse about these sort of inter-ethnic relations is what what their regime would depend on for the further stability. Because what's important to understand about Nazarbayev regime is that it did not want any of the protests of any sort, socioeconomic grievances, ethnic grievances, secessionism, and so on and so forth, especially in the beginning after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were really trying to avoid all of these excesses and protests. So the nationalizing regime in Kazakhstan, and I wrote it in detail in the book, has followed a specific model provision of personalized nationalizing regime, not based on the specific idea as I compare it to Latvia, which I call ideational regime, not the specific privilege of a specific of a group, the core ethnic group, but on the privilege and position and power of the specific leader. And that's why the regime became not personalized, because everything connected to nation building ideas and meaning production was connected straight back to Nazarbayev himself. Over the period of prolonged, again, he was in power for 30 years, of course, he was able to establish the type of narratives and discourses that, of course, discourses are never controllable, but the type of dominant discourse that he is the guarantor of the inter-ethnic peace, he's the guarantor of the stability that comes from that peace, and thus he needs to remain as a strong president in order to keep that prosperous and stable Kazakhstan in place. And then what is very important in this particular relation is that within the regime itself, and we're talking also about non-democratic context, political context, the elites themselves who wanted to be part of that regime, they had to play by the specific rules of the game, where they had to show the loyalty to Nazarbayev and build all of their discourses along this line. That's why we're seeing some of the drastic decisions to rename major streets in major cities, rename the capital city itself in the end, and so forth. That it was pretty much the elite field that defined this changes and this decision making. But on the ground, we see a far more complex conditions, and exactly what I'm arguing in my forthcoming manuscript is that the groups that start forming, whether social movements or specific spontaneous protest groups that emerge and then can decipher and sort of fall out from the field of contestation, they started changing the regime and changing its frames of the political, and they started shaping this particular perspective. So what Nazarbayev regime was able to achieve, which is very important, it sustained the specific regime-led understanding of ethnicity within the society, that there was a division into Kazakh-speaking, for example, groups, and then a division into Russian-speaking groups that the president himself addressed, for example, in his speeches and all of his narratives that would sometimes, in different languages, obviously in Kazakh or in Russian, and he tried to rigidly divide them in the meaning that he was producing. And often in his speeches, he produced the types of narratives that would be counterintuitive, or like, sort of overlapping with each other and being contesting each other on the same ground. So to the Kazakhs, he would promise that we are building the great nation, Mangalik Yel, the eternal nation of Kazakhs. And then to everybody else who spoke Russian and didn't identify maybe as Kazakhs, he would, in his perception and in his regime, nationalizing regime, he would basically talk about unity, stability, interethnic peace. We all, like, we all here together, and so on and so forth. So I'm not a proponent of believing that, well, we're going to talk about civic aspect of that in general, separately if you want to talk about it, but definitely he tried to create the type of rigid division in his own speeches. This is what I call compartmentalized ideology, where obviously it's like, coming back to the idea whether it is ideology or not, but he definitely tried to separate these two audiences based on their values and based on their socio-ethnic attribution. And what is very important is that this rigidness also pretty much worked on the regime level, but on the ground we see a lot of complexity and different voices that emerge out of that. So what I'm very interested in is not only looking into how people identify, and of course the identities are constantly contextual. There are a lot of people who are not ethnic Kazakhs, but they have the same level and rigorousness of speaking in Kazakh that Nazarbayev, for example, maybe did not anticipate. There are also a lot of Russian-speaking Kazakhs who also can decipher different parts of the speech and address an ideology itself. So in many ways, it didn't really remain on the type of elite imagination and regime's paradigms itself. But then what that division created is that it also divided the political field in itself, and a lot of politicians then had to follow these divisions. I know I have half a minute left, but what is really important about social movements and protest movements that emerge is that they counter this perspective, and they bring this idea of Kazakhstani solidarity that is not emerging from top down or imposed from top down, but is actually emerging from the bottom up. And I think that's one of the aspects that a lot of people looking into Kazakh protests right now do not see, in the sense that there is a huge solidarity of unity, of being, of course, anti-corruption and anti-regime and anti-Nazarbayev himself. And I'm going to talk about later on maybe about what's going to happen to this personalized regime and how it's going to change into the ideas of Tokayev being the peace builder and coming in, like, to create the order and clear up the chaos. There are these nationalizing regimes that I'm exploring in other countries as well. There is this scenario there, definitely. But what is really important, and the takeaway I want people to focus on, is that the ethnicity on the ground is far more complex than we're seeing it from the Soviet perspective of dividing into Kazakh-speaking or Russian-speaking. And the unity that emerged out of these protests themselves is very much this idea of the new idea of Kazakhstani solidarity that is not the one imposed by the regime, but the one that is, progressed by the grassroots movements themselves. So I don't have enough time to go into more detail, but I hope we'll come back to it in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. I think we have, very engaged, lots of material now for very engaging. Oh, I'm sorry. It says that it was my timer, which was buzzing, not my phone. All right. I think I don't want to reflect on that right now. I think we can listen to all our speakers and then have our own internal discussion before opening up the Q&A. So I will invite now Dr. Asel Tutumlu. She is assistant professor in political science and international relations at Near Eastern University in Northern Cyprus. So please, Asel, you have 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's joining us today. So what I wanted to do is to actually kind of look at the history of protests in Kazakhstan and to basically evaluate why exactly we have kind of shifted away from the rights-based claims to more entitlement claims, and what exactly was wrong with the system, and also then give you a kind of my assessment of the policies to come. So basically what my question was, basically what happens with the nature of power in the Nazarbayev's authoritarian structure and the type of justice claims that appeared. What we have seen historically, and Diana nicely outlined different protests that have appeared, is that majority of them had the socioeconomic nature. And the majority of them were not necessarily about building particular procedural norms, asking government to adhere to some legal mechanisms, although there were plenty of those as well. But we have seen a growing, so to say, trend towards the protests that are based on entitlement, where people would come out on the streets and ask for the particular solution of their ongoing problems. So, for example, mothers with multiple children who may not necessarily have the legal right, for example, to receive an apartment, but who come out on the street and tell that you have to give me something because my living condition is really, really terrible. And we have seen a lot of this protests based on entitlements recently. And I just wanted to kind of explore what does it mean for the present, for the events that happen in Kazakhstan, and what exactly, how does it explain Tokayev's platform that he has outlined in his speech on January 11th. So we usually operate in academia with kind of very bifurcated concepts where we assume that the rule is supposed to adhere or describe authoritarian regimes, but governance somehow belongs to the democratic regimes. And so the whole conventional theories of authoritarian regimes are based on the fact that we kind of very much mix the idea of authoritarianism and dictatorship, where we assume that the person who is a dictator operates based on rule, on personal rule, through domination, restriction, organization to ensure order. And the concept of governance is somehow more sophisticated, that describes democracies, that describes management, that enables people to govern themselves, or allows them to decide how they should be governed. And the authorities in that sense is kind of decentered, although we do have, for example, the state having a privileged domination or dominant position in times of state of emergencies and decisions over life and death. But at the same time, governance usually becomes reflected or embedded in these ideas of laws and institutions. And so it's very much a procedural concept that assumed to be fair, inclusive, necessary, and inevitable to preserve this type of social order. The principles of rule are nonetheless adhered, as I said, to the authoritarian conditions, and therefore politics, as we can see, is no longer vested in the conflict between the state and society, because rule exists, and therefore the position of power or the person in power exists outside and above the procedure or the rule of law. That enables various elites to exercise informal access to decision-making process to obtain special treatment. And in the formal realm, we actually have a different type of system that operates that are again vested in our legal codes. And what is interesting is that in Kazakhstan, we have seen two systems operate at the same time. And it's not only, I think, the nature of Kazakhstani regime, it's pretty much a nature of many other authoritarian regimes that are located outside and inside the post-Soviet space, where we see that certain elites that are relatively insulated, they have the access to the decision-making power and special treatment based on the rule. And then you have the other people, the rest, so to say, of us, who have to basically operate in the formal realm, and as a result of that, use or rely on the laws that are established. And in that sense, the formal law that exists in these authoritarian regimes, in this kind of hybrids, is not necessarily fair as well. The formal law, as Dostum Sapayev, I think, calls it, political technology rather than politics. It basically reflects the type of things that elites, that justifies the special treatments for the elites. And the actual face of politics or the nexus of politics is no longer in the law, it's actually in the rule. And I think this is very important to understand this. And this is, again, an ongoing work, both in my manuscript and in the article that Diana and I are working on. But I think it's very interesting to see these dimensions because it enables us to explain why particular people basically went against Nazarbayev's regime because they saw the nexus of power there, and why for many of them the idea of legal right, legal opposition, or some kind of the idea of political parties and so on was actually a no and not an option, because that's not where the locus of power is. And to draw the distinctions is that in the formal governance model that the authoritarian Nazarbayev's regime offered us, we see that the legal norms foster, or supposed to foster, or promise to foster free market, individual responsibility, competitiveness, entrepreneurship. They operate through the tactics of kind of legal guarantees of freedoms, pluralism, and opposition. They use the following tools, such as in the realm of political technologies, post-truths, half-speaks, and so on. And as a result of that, we get a kind of a polarized society polarized message, where on the one hand, the government promises all of these things. And we have seen the importance of this image making for the government of Kazakhstan abroad, that basically comes out and says, no, we are not really the rule-based, in my sense, rule-based, personal rule-based system. We are actually all about governance. But it also enables them to tolerate inequality, tolerate poverty, tolerate very dysfunctional public institutions. And in the informal realm, what we have instead is that it works through the distribution of control over the main assets and income streams. And so it was very common, for example, to hear people that, for example, these people are sitting na potoke. So they basically control a certain stream of rents or money. And the tactics that are used to suppress the attempts to basically get into that type of informal system of rent distribution is basically they're very known. For example, we remember kettling that was used against people who try to make that particular structure more inclusive, trolling, provocations, and obviously the use of state media propaganda. And as a result of that, we can see that the whole power is no longer, again, vested in the institutions in the informal realm, but it is vested in a certain guarantor of the system, which can be a dictator, a political party, or a parliament, but which enables the elites within that particular insulated system to continue to get rich. And what was interesting is that if we include, or if we take a look at Tokayev's speech on January 11th, he proposes a listening state with a kind of a welfare face. We can see that most of these aspirations, let's say, or plans that he's trying to introduce, not only show that, okay, that maybe he is going to limit the influence of Nazarbayev's clans, or at least financial industrial groups that were linked to the former ruler, but at least show to us that he is aware, very much aware of this growing entitlement claims, and he's trying to preempt further protests and co-opt participation of the poorest people by basically promising them some kind of benefit, which is material, without necessarily opening political freedoms. And so that leads me to think that probably this distinction between, or the existing regime is simply kind of the one of the same, if not worse. We are yet to see what will happen to the people who are arrested without their names disclosed and without the due process. But if Tokayev is to kind of follow the existing pattern, it seems like there will be a more welfare redistribution without the political opening. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Asel. So we moved from non-state actors to state actors, and then we will move in our third presentation to international actors. So I'm inviting Alexander Koulé to join, Dr. Alexander Koulé to join us. He is a Tow professor, a Clare Tow professor of political science at Barnard College, and director of Columbia's, former, until very recently, former director of Columbia's University's Harriman Institute, which is hosting ASN every year. I hope this cooperation will continue. So Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. So please, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll second the hope that the cooperation will continue through this adversity and for many years to come. It's a real pleasure to be on the panel. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege to learn from scholars like Diana and Asel on the domestic dynamics and how they overturn some of our conventional understandings and theories of both social movements, identity formation, and sort of systemic change. I want to do something maybe a little bit analogous on the IR regional studies realm. And, you know, what I want to throw out there, rather than thinking about this domestic politics or the international context, I want to think about how the domestic is embedded in the regional and some of the new connections and associations that might emerge as a result of what happened. So I want to make sort of three broad areas of interventions here, pardon the pun. The first is, why did the CSTO intervene now in this particular case? The first time in its 30-year history, or 20-year history, if you want to take with its current institutional capacity. And there were plenty of crises and conflicts and opportunities before. Just to note, two important examples. In 2010, when the government of Kyrgyzstan collapsed following the Bakiyevs fleeing, and we had ethnic conflict erupt in the south between ethnic Kyrgyz and Uzbek communities, then acting premier Rosa Otunbayeva turned to then President Medvedev, imploring him to send Russian peacekeepers under CSTO auspices or just otherwise. And Medvedev refused, the CSTO refused, and they cited a legal reason that it wasn't empowered to intervene in domestic conflict, and this is a domestic matter and so forth. And then, of course, in December 2010, the CSTO changed its charter to allow for this. My sense, this was a fig leaf. I think the bottom line there was Russia had no interest in becoming embroiled in a regional conflict in Central Asia, especially as then Islam Karimov was also considering intervention by Uzbekistan over the border to try and diffuse things, right? So this is something Russia just wanted to stay out of. Ditto to 2020. The re-eruption of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia, invokes the CSTO, asks them to come in and intervene on behalf of Armenian forces. The organization sits on the request, and in the end, after months, says, "Yeah, no, because actually this is over disputed territory. It's not your territorial defense." And again, that's the legal reason. The practical reason is Moscow does not want to pick sides between Armenia and Azerbaijan, even though Armenia, yes, is an ally. Azerbaijan is a really critical partner in many respects too. I mentioned these examples by way of introduction that the popular perception amongst the think tank community, analysts, some academics, though not all, come to some important exceptions, was that then the CSTO was just a fig leaf. It was a talk shop. It didn't do anything, right? It was even a virtual organization because when push come to shove, when it actually had a crisis to solve, it always refused to get involved, right? And so there's also that kind of thing, a patronizing attitude towards it. So why now? And what's striking to me was the speed at which the CSTO decided to intervene. Basically an all-night consultation. Lukashenko and Putin were at the center of this, and they signed off on Tokayev's request. So what's going on here? I think, a couple of reasons. One, there's a genuine dislike and fear of street protests and what they mean for regimes. So certainly Lukashenko's fear since 2020. Putin has absolutely been shaped by Bolotnaya, another street protest. So as in a region of demonstration effects, they clearly saw this as a very negative trend that could rebound and impact on them. That's one. But two, if this was indeed and is an elite power struggle between Tokayev and the former ruling family and their political allies, then I think Putin also wanted to send a signal that he backed status quo power, right? He backed the residing authority of Tokayev and the regime, and sent a signal to any security services that maybe had been wavering, right, about where Moscow's allegiance is going to be. And again, what we saw in the choice of targets of the peacekeepers was quite interesting. Sort of defending installations, Almaty airport, economic installations. They weren't there confronting the protesters and certainly not firing upon them, right? So this was a very carefully calibrated script that continues to today. Mission accomplished, it was efficient, it was done, they're withdrawing. You know, you see how effective the CSTO can be, right? So all of this, I don't think Putin had pre-planned this or scripted this, but once afforded the opportunity to do this, I think it fell into his lap and he seized it. I think the really noticeable framing issue here is how Putin reflexively accepted Tokayev's view that there's tens of thousands of sort of thugs, militants, external forces intervening, you know, nefarious elements, this kind of color revolution type of rhetoric that legitimized the CSTO coming in. So where does that leave us analytically? Actually, we have some very good scholarship that hasn't made it into mainstream analysis of these regional organizations. Roy Allison published a set of pieces where he talked about virtual regionalism and the protective integration function of regional organizations, that beyond all, they're not there to enable cooperation and sovereign pooling, they're there to defensively protect regimes and the status quo. That's the definition of security, right? And a security threat is as much a street protest that threatens to delegitimize and destabilize a regime as it is a transnational militant coming in over the border, right? Also, Alexander Liebman, Anastasia Obudenkova have a series of really good papers in a book too on how regional organizations promote autocratic regime stability and maintenance. And so I think that's, you know, that's the kind of analytic part of this, and this was an absolute test case for that viewpoint. Two, what's the potential significance of this intervention? Well, you know, to me, this is an example of the alternative type now of regional ordering, right, that you see across Central Asia and Eurasia. And that is this regional organization providing not only this kind of, whether it was decisive or not, we'll call it politically significant intervention, but also upholding the norm that it is unacceptable to have mass protests. And it is also, as long as these can be coded externally induced or sponsored, then it is perfectly possible to be intransigent against them, right? To really crack down. And this kind of normative framework, some would call it an illiberal framework, is part of this kind of new ordering architecture that's being built in the region. I would sort of break this down into a couple of dimensions. One is, there's been some speculation, what is Russia expecting in return, right? The answer is we don't know. I do think Putin has been quite smart to not publicly demand concessions, right, from Tokayev. I think that would have jeopardized Tokayev's legitimacy. It would play into narratives that he's undermining Kazakh sovereignty. So quick, efficient, mission accomplished, we're leaving. But I would not be surprised that there is a quid asked for. It would be very unusual if there weren't. So what should we look for? Maybe a couple months from now, there's an announcement, oh, there's going to be a joint facility, security facility under CSTO auspices open, maybe in the north of the country, right? We don't know. Maybe there's a possibility that Kazakhstan starts to back Moscow on regional priorities and policy issues, right? And again, the analogy here is Lukashenko. Lukashenko used to try and create distance for himself to maneuver between Ukraine and Russia, especially after 2014, right? So-called Minsk Accords. After Putin came out unequivocally backing him and said that he would do so with Russian troops, Lukashenko changes his tune and on Ukraine and backs the Russian position. It'll be very interesting to me to see if we get similar change and shift from the foreign ministry going forward. You know, for the most part, the Central Asian countries have avoided the Crimea issue like there's no tomorrow, right? So that's another dimension of this. And then, of course, we saw China also accept, eventually, after some concern, this kind of normative framing of what's going on. It's an internal matter. We must combat the three evils and so forth. Let me make one more brief point, and I can take up in Q&A, another internal-external linkage that we're not, perhaps we're not accustomed to paying attention to that we should. If this is indeed now a feud between Tokayev and the Nazarbayevs, and the Nazarbayevs have gone into exile, then we need to pay attention not only to politics within Kazakhstan and the possible transfer of assets, right, Alia's recycling operation and so forth, you know, possible moves against energy holdings, banking sectors, financial sectors, but how these are embedded in a global context, right? The holdings that are in London, in Paris, in Geneva, that are in the Gulf. And I think this can go one of two ways, right? The hardcore, extreme kind of all-out economic war would be like the Ablyasov model, right? That the Kazakh government would mobilize every resource it had. It would engage in high-profile, expensive litigations. It would go after every asset the Nazarbayevs had, try to discredit them, hire PR agents, do the whole thing. That's one extreme. The other extreme would be some sort of pacted transition, right? And some sort of outreach. Hand over a couple of very symbolic assets so we can say that we have returned them to the Kazakh people, and we shall leave you alone, and we shall leave the family alone to enjoy your exile in the Gulf or in London or whatever it happens to be. But I would say the family is vulnerable in some jurisdictions, not so much in the Gulf, but certainly in a place like London. Dariga won an unexplained wealth order case on the basis that the Kazakh prosecutors didn't provide dirt on her business dealings, right? And said that she was completely legitimate and these assets had been acquired in a regular way. If that piece of it changes, then someone like her might potentially be open to another action in a jurisdiction that has this kind of extraterritorial anti-corruption legislation. So that's another part of this I'm keeping my focus on. Yes, it's an inter-Kazakh thing, but the inter-Kazakh struggle can take place in a more kind of global arena too. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alexander. So I just wanted to bring in a few questions for our panelists before opening the Q&A. So I saw people are asking questions in the chat, so please use the Q&A box. We are monitoring this, so if you have a question, make sure to post it in the Q&A box so that we see it. The chat box is for sharing references. I guess they can also be shared in the Q&A section. People will see them. So I would like to maybe bring back the focus on protesters. So we have moved from the small to the biggest issues, and maybe come back. One thing that I was got me interested when I was hearing all the presentations was, what kind of leverage does the population of Kazakhstan have today on domestic issues, or maybe on international issues even? I mean, so often we think that we as citizens do not have a lot of leverage of what is happening internationally, but we can through a lot of civilian initiatives. I'm thinking, for instance, of the investigation journalism that brought to light a lot of the corruption scandals recently, the Panama and Pegasus papers. I mean, these are not necessarily made by the population of Kazakhstan, but people have sort of can grasp very easily what is going on and make claims and run their own investigation and help those investigations. So I'm thinking also of the recent, how was it called, the spying spyware that Kazakhstan has also maybe was revealing something about inter-elite fighting already, right? This should have given us some red flags about what was going on, the spying between elites. That's an interesting aspect. But coming back to leverage, so people might have some leverage in uncovering some of the excesses if they are, as Tokayev actions seem to suggest, if they are encouraged to criticize and openly criticize and dig some dirt, let's say. So that's one question. Do they have leverage? So Asel, you were talking about the listening state. So this is something that Tokayev has been promoting since he became president 2 years ago, or yeah, June 2019. And do these protests will bring encourage this, or do you think these are empty words, and that the society will not have greater leverage? Some of the protesters, we should mention, were asking for electing their own hakims, right? Their own hakims, so the equivalent of regional governors, right, which are currently appointed by the president. So do you think we can see this kind of initiative being adopted by the government for more accountability and more and that people could have a say in their in the local governance? And finally, Diana, I was interested in if you think, so you were saying that people are bringing up now this sort of bottom-up aspect of national identity. Do you think that people who are active in this regard can actually have some influence in redefining national identity at the top? So basically, I would like to hear you about what kind of leverage on different levels that people can have following those events, those unprecedented mobilization. Thank you. Maybe we take 10 minutes to discuss that, and then we'll open up the floor. It will be 30 minutes left for, 30 minutes left for discussion and then Q&A. Thank you.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please, Asel, yes.
Okay. Well, in terms of leverage, it really depends when the state of emergency is lifted across the country, what exactly is going to remain, what type of outlets, what type of political organizations, what type of activists are going to remain on the political scene, and what would be the scope and scale of their involvement. Because right now we cannot really tell, since under the state of emergency, I mean, government has been arresting people without actually telling us again the lists of who has been arrested and what exactly on which charges. So in terms of the independent media that will be able to dig the dirt, so to say, I think these things are relatively known and they are happening, but it really shows that when people receive this news, the idea is not really that surprising, right? So when we hear news that billions and millions of dollars have been siphoned somewhere in different accounts, it's not that surprising. And as a result of that, people don't necessarily, I mean, yes, it challenges their, I mean, they look around and they look at themselves and they are potentially very disenchanted by the system. But it also enables them to go on the street, for example, and then loot the banks, stores that belong to this type of affiliated elites as well, because as Asel Dolot has been doing in her research, they just simply say that or think that this money has been adopted illegally based on at the expense of their welfare. So I don't necessarily see that there is a big leverage for people to have some kind of political opening at this point, because the regime, as I said, kind of decided to co-opt the majority of this political desire for political change. And we can see that also in Tokayev's speech, where instead of opening, for example, in introducing political reforms on hakims and other participation of different people and activists in the decision-making process, instead he's trying to reshuffle the budgetary mechanisms so that more money would remain in the provinces rather than in the center or come to the capital. And so by doing this, he's basically trying to enhance the quality of life of the regular people in hopes that they may not necessarily get out on the streets again. In terms of political opening, I don't really see much leverage, but the inadvertent result of this particular protest has been at least the symbolic, or may not be, the desire to have more welfare-oriented state.
Thank you. Maybe Diana, you want to go second?
Maybe Alex.
Yeah.
As you wish.
Yeah, sure. I'll just briefly address the question of what would domestic perceptions be of some of these things playing out. We have an imperfect model, which was Uzbekistan, which is much more close society than in Kazakhstan has. And there you saw when Gulnara Karimova was under investigation for these grand corruption scandals, most notably money laundering and accepting bribes for 3G licenses. And this happened in Sweden and the Netherlands and the US. It really damaged her politically to the point that her father threw her underboard, right? This wasn't a transition jailing. This happened while he was on watch, and he sided with the security services against her. So what happens outside does have the potential to reverberate back in. And this is why crafting that narrative is so important. Right? Is someone in exile a Democrat? Are they corrupt? Are they seeking to destabilize the country? Have they grown rich on the wealth of the people? I mean, all of these are really important when you frame that story for domestic consumption. But again, this is all early days and we're speculating about what that information campaign would look like.
All right, thank you. And yeah,
fascinating discussion. I'm so grateful. I'm in such a great panel with fascinating colleagues. I'm really learning a lot from all of you. I think that question on leverage is very, very important, and I would answer it from from more of a continuity and historical perspective, because I am kind of like on the verge. Well, I'm doing both historical sociology and political sociology, and for me, everything is again back in the narrative, and I completely agree with Professor Cooley on that. And it's also in sort of like, how do the people build up on this narrative? So I'm just going to explain briefly, and then I'm going to use one example. So I think, and the quick answer to that is that yes, leverage is possible if there is formalization or institutionalization of these things. Because as again, going back to Asel's point on procedural aspects, I think it's very, very important that some of these movements actually talking about the procedural perspective. For Kazakhstan, for example, openly says that they don't want to formalize according to the existing rules because they don't believe the system is democratic enough or political enough, where they don't want to play basically by the rules of the game that are highly authoritarian, and they don't want to basically run for the parliament knowing that they would never make it by any sense even to the election. They will never be allowed to run for it or even register as a party. So that's I think is a very important thing. But nevertheless, if we are talking about, this is a very institutionalized authoritarian regime that is basing a lot of things on both domestic legal systems, but also, as Professor Cooley correctly said, and sort of what happens outside to it as well. But to me, the quick answer to that is that nevertheless, there is a necessity of continuity and institutionalization of these different groups. They cannot exist, more or less in this ad hoc situation where they come on the streets. They do see that they're being heard, because remember that the government responded immediately, and they sent the commission to Aktau on the 3rd of January. So it works as a strategy, but this is not a long-term strategy that can work as sort of like, again, in terms of changing deeper structures of inequality that these people very much protesting against. So to me, the answer to that would be, you have to enter the political, and you have to change the rules of the game from within the political. That's why it's so important that there are these attempts from 2019 in order to change the narrative, or to change the even nationalizing regime itself from its own structure by playing outside the regime. And that's why they haven't been yet successful in very much. But to me, the answer would be that they need to enter it. And for example, if they get a minister, let's say of education, or some position in the cabinet at some point, they'll be able to at least leverage somehow, but they need to be institutionalized. And and I wanted to use, but then on the other hand, there is this kind of like, a symbolic perspective where you can push the frames of the political, and you can criticize it largely by using some of the unexpected tools that the regime cannot simply decipher quickly enough. So the regime is very much myopic to the perspective of online activism. They don't know the difference between Instagram stories from the video that is saved on the phone. And that's what actually saved a lot of, perspectives. One of the activists was kidnapped by the police in 2020 after the lone picket protesting. And she managed to capture it on the Instagram story that obviously is disappearing after 24 hours, but it only stays on Instagram. It doesn't stay on your phone. And the policemen they knew that she filmed them, but they couldn't find it in her phone because they didn't open her Instagram. Maybe I shouldn't say that because now they will listen and they will start checking everything. But these things, fairly small things that the regime simply cannot respond to the protest movements, especially social movements like around Kazakhstan that I'm studying in detail. Or for example, those Banksy type poster wars that they engaged with, right? When they would put the poster and it would be like bodiless. That's what I'm exploring in the manuscript, is that there are no people to arrest, but the protest act is happening, and the poster would basically say 300 billion or 3 billion for renaming or for the name. And that's what they basically started this campaign to cancel the leader of the nation, cancel Yelbasi, in hashtag again. And the regime, what is the hashtag? And a lot of these ministers, and I'm not blaming, I'm not being ageist here, but you see that type of activism that is very much innovative, also operating in different fields that the regime is slowly acquiring knowledge about, but also that perspective, they're citing a constitution in this poster that the people are the source of the power, right? And that's the first article in the constitution, but it's a poster. So who do you arrest if there is just a poster there and there are no people holding it? So I think for the regime, this contention that happened since 2019, that was called locally Kazakh Koktemi, Kazakh Spring, but not the Arab Spring, Prague Spring, in reference to the Prague Spring, gradual political reforms, without the bloodshed, without radical changes, but basically the transit to democratization that they staged in Almaty and in other cities. The regime was basically they did not know how to respond. And I'm looking into the law enforcement perspectives and dimension and relation with that movement. It's slowly learning and slowly expanding their old even repression apparatus and how they respond. So I think that kind of conceptualization of the movement having sort of leverage of expanding how the regime operates is very, very important. Again, I'm the scholar who is obsessed with regimes and studying regime as a concept and as a power relation. So forgive me for that. And in terms of focusing, because the state I think is fairly different from what we're seeing here. And regime tries to occupy the state, but what the activists are talking about is that they want to bring the state back in. If to quote again. Some of the older colleagues, but to bring the state back into the people rather than to the corrupt elites. And the bottom aspect of the national identity, I think people will have at certain point aspect of influencing it. If again, the answer to that is if they become institutionalized, if their claims become more continuous, prolonged, and will have that type of power that the regime can decipher and understand. But so far, if they continue, again, this protest was very much important. It had the potency. The people understood that they have the power. They were happy with the flag, singing the anthem. We've seen the first-hand reports, eyewitnesses reports. But I'm sure the regime right now would do everything in its power to stop this from happening again. So that's why the protesters and all those who want to change something in Kazakhstan need to think of different ways and sometimes be even more innovative in how they speak to the regime, not to the state, but they speak to the regime. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. Some of them we have answered already through, in a written form, but there are still 23 questions I see now. So I'll ask two first, or yeah, maybe the first three ones. I guess the first one would be more directed to Diana from Nia Feinstein. Can we make a connection between the linguistic importance of Russian versus Kazakh to the situation in Belarus regarding nationalism and language? So I guess that would be more for Diana. Belgin-san is asking, what is the role of competition over access to resources such as natural gas, oil in the instigation of protests? Yeah, something that we haven't addressed. And the third one by Anonymous, if I think maybe we have already answered that a little bit. Will Tokayev's regime be the same as Nazarbayev? But yeah, some of this has been answered already. And then, yeah, I think we can start with that and move on. Who wants to start? Maybe Diana, the connection, maybe a comparison with Belarus. Do you see?
I couldn't answer that question in chat. I think it's the relation between Russian being dominant language in Belarus, maybe from that perspective more or less. And thankfully, I do have some data on Belarus from the previous project that was employed in GCRF Compass, where we have compared four different countries, and we had done focus groups in Belarus before the protest. And I think there was a lot of sort of data coming in from focus groups and discussions on the importance of Belarusian language, but for it not being enough explored in the public sphere. I remember some of the quotes from outside Minsk, from Mogilov, for example, when people just looking over the older generation spoke about it, and they also spoke about it in relation to sort of like, what did that old Soviet solidarity mean, and that Russian used to be that language of solidarity for people. Again, we need to decipher here from the people to the Soviet regime and the Soviet state. And I remember reading through that quote, and I thought this is so important as well, that for the older generation, it is definitely rooted in some sort of Sovietness, but for the younger generation, especially young people who were on the streets just now, I mean, they never experienced that. They were born in the 90s or they were born in 2000s. They don't have, the memory of Soviet Union is secondhand memory from what they hear from their grandparents or their parents, although their parents don't often speak about it. So for them, Russian becomes a little bit more of a different type of language. It's the language of opportunities, especially for Kazakhstan. Don't forget that, again, our statistics on linguistic proficiencies is usually unreliable. I'm looking into the levels of sort of, for example, school education. That's a bit more reliable from the Ministry of Education. We see a exponential growth of Kazakh-speaking education, but simply because the Kazakh ethnic Kazakhs, if you want to put them like that, as a group, again, very much we shouldn't see it as a rigid group, are becoming a majority in the country. So that's like, the connection. But we still have pretty much a large group of people either bilingual or speaking Russian, and they don't see it as, like many groups don't see it as a threat to a specific national idea, because national idea in Kazakhstan is a very much ambiguous and contextual and constantly moving concept, right? As I said, compartmentalized ideology for a very long time allowed Nazarbayev to basically create two completely different perceptions of it, and for them to coexist in the same country. I don't know any other case yet where that can coexist. Maybe in somebody, some of my reviewers used to tell me, like, look into Quebec, for example. I used to live in a Basque country that didn't work there at all because people were too bilingual and they couldn't respond to that. So in that sense, I think these are the biggest distinction, I would say, in the perceptions. And we don't see yet, again, this is not Crimea. This is not very much into what happened in Ukraine. This is not yet very much what happened in Belarus, and hopefully won't be. This is a very distinct case that we need to see. Kazakhstan has a very distinct sociolingual context in itself. That's why it's not yet about nationalism or specific nationalistic claims, and we shouldn't push it there because this is a very sensitive territory for the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the question, so we have lots of questions as well on the Russia's role and the CSTO's role. So before we ask that, I would have liked to maybe Asel to answer the issue of resources. Does the competition over resources is relevant here? It can explain some of the competition or mobilization and competition that is happening. Thank you.
Well, basically, of course, the protests began because of the rise of LPG, which is not necessarily the market-based. The prices are not based on competitive markets or on some economic platforms or stock exchange, as the government have tried to actually tell us. But it is based on the decision of certain individuals within the Nazarbayev, who are very close to, within the inner circle of Nazarbayev, who decide how much gas is actually going abroad and how much of that stays, as well as many different companies that are reselling, the wholesalers who are reselling to the gas stations, which are also controlled by certain people within the inner circle. And as a result of that, what you get is that people obviously see that they are living in the oil-rich state, but now they cannot even afford to have to drive their taxis or to drive their cars to serve as taxis to get at least a little bit of extra living, which they have used before. And so that creates, again, a very strong resentment towards the inner circle, towards the regime that was powered by Nazarbayev and his clique. And I think in that sense, what we are, since we haven't seen the competition in the oil and gas yet, and Alex has actually outlined two various scenarios, right, that we can get into the Karimov scenario, where the majority of assets would be returned, or at least there will be an attempt to go and return all the assets abroad, or and this is what my inclination is so far, to think that Nazarbayev and his inner circle will probably control the major economic assets and retain control over these, but in exchange they will not necessarily be in politics anymore. So the decision-making power would actually be sidelined, but they would have to simply share more and put more money into the state coffers so that Tokayev's regime looks more legitimate, more social, more listening, and more welfare-oriented. So I don't really see the competition in oil gas yet. And in that sense, to answer the question about Tokayev and Nazarbayev, I just basically see that so far, and again, this is all my speculation, is that there is probably some kind of a deal that has been done where Nazarbayev inner circle keeps the assets but gets out of politics, and Tokayev basically takes over.
Thank you. So Alexander, maybe you could answer some of the questions about the CSTO. So what people are interested in is it a distraction from Ukrainian affairs, which are very causing Russia quite a lot of problems internationally. So is it a distraction? And other questions were, how you mentioned Kyrgyzstan earlier, that the CSTO did not intervene in some of the very turbulent times that Kyrgyzstan went through, and why didn't they intervene in Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, in that last year? So what is the role of Armenia play in this decision in sending CSTO troops in Kazakhstan? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, you know, the person who's chairing the rotating sort of council chairmanship of the CSTO is Pashinyan, Prime Minister of Armenia. So it's particularly bitter for him to have to make the public announcement that the group had accepted President Tokayev's sort of invitation and to go in. And, you know, he had been imploring the mechanism to be used over the Karabakh conflict. Now, why wasn't it? You know, as I mentioned before, the practical reason is that Russia does not want to embroil itself, or does not want the group involved in regional conflicts, especially not between two states, right? And so they did not want to involve themselves in the Kyrgyz-Uzbek conflicts. They certainly did not want to involve themselves in an Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict. And they invoked the legal reasoning that the sovereign territory of Armenia was not threatened, which is true, right? We were talking about an Azeri operation to reclaim the surrounding villages on sovereign or legally sovereign sort of Azeri territory, as well as disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So they got themselves out of that one on legal grounds, but practically the last thing Moscow wants to do is to enter some sort of open-ended, conflict and security thing between two belligerent states, in the post-Soviet space. It's not something that it wants. So in this particular case, quelling, protest, playing kingmaker to a domestic dispute, all of these things were doable, and they involved, minimal backlash. One very interesting footnote of the Kyrgyz crisis, by the way, is that there was a leader in the region who was very upset that the CSTO did not intervene, apart from Rosa Otunbayeva, and that was actually Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko had a devastating critique of the CSTO back then. He said, why are we members of this thing if you don't even intervene member states' regimes that are about to collapse? And of course, Lukashenko took in Bakiev, right, in exile. So even back then, 11 years ago, Lukashenko was saying that primarily he viewed the CSTO as a regime defense mechanism. That's what the security purpose was, right? So again, none of this should come as a surprise. I think the problem is that we impose our kind of understanding of Western organizations, especially NATO and NATO-style architecture, rapid reaction forces, transnational threats, on what is essentially a regime defense and stabilizing kind of body now.
Thank you. Some of the questions are also about the nature of and identity of the protesters. So is there, Diana already mentioned that earlier, but maybe we can go into more details. The linguistic or social composition of protesters. So there were rumors that they were, well, the government claimed they were foreign trained terrorists, which is unlikely, but there were also rumors that there were Islamic radicals among the protesters, so or maybe some I don't know, very nationalist groups. And what is the role of clan politics, which was a very buzzing concept in our field for for a long time. So interestingly, not a lot of people have talked about it recently. I mean, analyzing those events, is it still relevant to talk about clan politics within maybe elite competition level and at the local level among the protesters?
One quick thing, look into class. I'm not only saying it as a sociologist, but I think it's a very important thing that is often missed, missed in general. People would prefer to look into only elites or only clans and try to find all this language, like, to complicate things. But what happened on the streets is a class issue. And we need to find, I'm not a Marxist, I always say that, I'm a realist, but nevertheless, we need to find the tools that are actually working to explain what happened. And when you define things through class and these particular grievances, what we see on the ground through eyewitness reports, none of the other things, including nationalism, even religious context, play as importantly as class played down there. And again, these people spoke at least Russian and Kazakh, from what I can see from eyewitness reports, from what I can hear from my respondents and people who were on the ground, again, in Almaty, because that's where our attention is mostly located right now. But majority of grievances was about impoverishment, not being able to afford or live up to the standards. And I think it's very symbolic that a lot of the pictures we see from the protests are with these slogans of prosperous Kazakhstan, 30 years of independence and stability. And a lot of them also with Nazarbayev's quotes. And one of my chapters in the forthcoming manuscript is opening up with this question the activist tells me: if the state is speaking to me, why can't I speak back? And to me, this is a crucial thing here, is that, all these grievances of injustice and inequality are very much located in disempowerment that they feel, but also for a lot of people who were spontaneously on the street, again, I'm using that word with a caveat, but who came on the street to show their voice, they also showed it through their class grievances. And last point there in terms of nationalism, to close that Pandora box, is that whenever you cannot afford basic utilities like bread or gas or whatever, whenever there's a system where you have to take, the Kaspi credit, where you have to take, food, and you have to be in debt, basically you have to get into debt to afford food. You don't really care what nation you belong to or what is your nationalism or any other things. When you cannot afford to provide food on your table, a lot of these things become completely, not even secondary, they become completely of a background noise to a lot of these people. So I think that's what we need to put it to base. But I'll shift the clan question to Asen.
Yeah, but that's really a great point, Diana. I think the class issue is in Central Asia often overlooked. This is not something people, very few scholars look at. And I think in this case, from what journalists have told us, there were lots of protesters were from marginalized areas. So yeah, for future research, that would be very important to look at it, definitely. Thanks for raising that point. Asel, you want to add something?
Yeah, just in terms of the clan, I don't think it was actually about the clan. I mean, Nazarbayev's regime, I think by mid-2000s, have consolidated pretty much the whole power around him. So I don't think we should be talking about any threatening oppositional or any other, any other group that can challenge his political or economic authority. And so in that sense, I think the clans are just, I mean, it's not really what describes the situation on the ground. What we can describe the situation with is financial industrial groups that have controlled through their political affiliation certain particular assets, and they were engaged in various redistribution schemes among the affiliated companies. And so in that sense, yes, we can talk about, so to say, the pyramid that was established where certain people were responsible or were allowed, let's say, to get the stream, to get the access on the stream of money, let's say. And so these rents were then redistributed either among themselves or, as I said, among the affiliated companies. So I think it was the system itself became much less related to what kind of clan you belong to, or Rus or any other. It was basically about what kind of stream or where is exactly your stream of money is located, and who has bigger or smaller stream. And that's, I think, what explains the power relations and the contestation as well.
Thank you. Alexander, did you want to reflect on that, or should we?
No, let's keep going.
Yeah, sure. One question was about the elite reshuffling. So are we seeing more people, more regime outsiders? So what about the composition? If you could say a few things about the composition of the cabinet. So are we seeing sort of an authentic elite reshuffling, or is it relatively cosmetic?
Just quickly, the sacked minister of energy, and he's like, who completely failed the whole thing and possibly caused the triggering of the crisis, was appointed as president's advisor. I think that's very much clear to the fact that nothing really changed. It was the reshuffling of all the people that that people on the street did not really like, that make fun of them in Telegram chats and so on and so forth. They just moved from the cabinet to the administration of the president, to the advisory of the president, and so on and so forth. And those who were in the administration moved back to the cabinet. So no, nothing changed.
Maybe I can add a little bit. I mean, it was kind of interesting to see the new prime minister with his background in statistics. And it reminded me also that he is probably doing his own audit to calculate the real size of unemployment, the real size of poverty, the real size of assets, the real size of everything, so that Tokayev's regime can actually get the real information about who owns what exactly and where it's located. And as a statistician, I think he has plenty of things to do on his agenda for the next 6 months. It was also interesting to see the two agencies that have been much more empowered than before. So, for example, Agency of Strategic Planning and Agency of State Services. So we can see that basically Tokayev is trying to ensure that we do have adequate people who, again, still technocrats, who may not necessarily have the power of the decision-making process, but nonetheless who have the capacity to at least design some system that can deliver the promises that he has put out in his speech. And as well as that have the capacity bureaucratically, where people have the ability to again deliver this type of reforms. So that's, I think, where the key institutions will be. In addition, of course, to the reform of the law enforcement bodies, which we are expecting to be highly more militarized and more so legally protected against public violence than before.
Thank you. Maybe we take one final question because we have to wrap up a little bit. There will be final words by our host, Zsuzsa. So my final question would be for Alexander. It's a bit of a parallel. So do we expect any changes? So we have answered the question, do we expect any changes in the domestic politics? So what about the international politics? So Kazakhstan prides itself in having a multi-vector policy, and Tokayev himself is a diplomat, career diplomat. So he has ties with people all over the world. Do we expect some changes in a multi-vector policy.
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. And of course, multi-vectorism is a really important analytical concept that the study of Central Asian states' foreign policy has given us. And so my thoughts on this is that all of the Central Asian states, well, for the most part, the technocrats and foreign ministries wish to exercise a version of multi-vectorism, right? You want to maintain good relationships with Russia, with China, with the West, with the Gulf, and so forth. But that's aspirational, yeah? Like, in the end, what kinds of structural conditions enable multi-vectorism? In the 2000s, when I looked at the question, there was the resurgent Russia under Putin, there was economic growing China, and there was security cooperation with the US. Yes, over Afghanistan, but you can't underestimate that. The kinds of ties that created, that's a structural kind of power relation. Now, fast forward 2014, and afterwards the US withdraws, it leaves Manas, there's a perception it leaves Afghanistan, then it leaves Afghanistan, you have Crimean ripple effects, and then of course you have the Belt and Road. So it's China and Russia re-engaging with the region, intensifying their engagement, and the West being perceived as withdrawing. So the desire for multi-vectorism is still there, but it's not at all clear that it's always possible. And the one other thing I would point here is this is the difference, I think, between a kind of a regime perspective and a state interest perspective. I think the state interest is in multi-vectorism, but crises and conflicts, when they threaten regimes, change a calculation. They change the calculus, right? It becomes more existential. And those are the pivotal moments that might change. I'm not predicting a huge change, but certainly what happened in terms of Russia being viewed again as a guarantor of regime stability and security is likely to shape perceptions and crystallize them sort of for some time.
All right, thank you so much. I think we will have to stop here taking questions, and I would really want to thank everybody for their engagement, for the presentations. I think we will continue to follow the developments, the reforms that are coming, hopefully will have positive impacts in on the lives of people on the ground. Yeah, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but we are hoping for positive developments. I will give back the floor to Zhuzha, please, so she will say a few final words, but thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Helen, for moderating this really fascinating discussion. And this was our first public event on Virtual ESN this year, 2022. And I'm delighted that we were able to start with such a panel of experts who have given us so much food for thought. That's not only about this series of events in Kazakhstan, but also about larger questions of not just this post-Soviet space, but what's going on in the larger region that is the traditional region of ESN, and even beyond that. Each of you has mentioned something that's really a big question that many other societies are facing today. So this is really exciting, and I'd like to thank all of you. And I would also like to take the opportunity to mention that to our awesome international audience whose questions help us keep the high level of these conversations, and whose engagement motivates us to keep Virtual ESN active and present in your lives, that we are going to have another event next week, which is also about this post-Soviet space. And that one is focusing on the question of how contested identities, shifting identities, something that was mentioned today as well, have played a role in the state-making process in place. From the perspective of local populations, and the focus in that one will be on Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. And so please watch out for an announcement for that panel. And you can also go on the virtual ESN website, on which, by the way, all of these panels that are recorded are placed. And so you can also download, use this for teaching. And so we already have a pretty nice repertoire of recorded panels of expert conversations. And so with that, I'm going to close, and I wish everyone a great evening, night, rest of the day. See you back next week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.